In the last two lectures, we examined the ideas of the Enlightenment and several attempts to put them into practice. Now, it's perhaps no accident that following in the decade of the Great American Experiment between 1787 and 1789, there were liberal or nationalistic rebellions in other subject territories in Europe. In the Netherlands, a Dutch patriot revolt against the stadtholder, which failed when Prussia intervened to crush it. In the Austrian Netherlands, that is Belgium, a revolt for independence and democracy which failed when the Catholic Church and aristocracy rallied the peasantry against it. And in Poland, Polish patriots led a failed nationalistic revolt against Russian influence, which failed when Catherine the Great said, "Niet." But the most dramatic, important, and momentarily successful of all was the French Revolution. In the end, as we shall see, the French Revolution did not result in a libertarian, egalitarian, constitutional, or democratic paradise. But along with the Industrial Revolution that we will address a few lectures hence, it did spell the beginning of the end of the Ancien Regime, and it spread Enlightenment ideals across Europe and down into its lowest social ranks. What caused it? I could argue that our course so far has been outlining the principal cause of the French and attendant revolutions from the very beginning. That is, it could be said that the whole political, social, and economic system of Europe was increasingly unfair, inefficient, oppressive, and unrealistic, bound to come apart sooner or later. Put another way, one could say that the Ancien Regime sowed the seeds of its own destruction. But even if we can agree on that, and many historians would disagree, that still doesn't explain the where and the when. Why France, and why 1789? The obvious place to start was the financial situation of the French government. As we have seen, French government finances had passed in and out of trouble throughout the 18th century. The problems included recurrent war, a failure to figure out how to manage and service French government debt as productively as the British did. There was no national bank to regulate the money supply or to make loans to the government. Instead, the French government survived on ad hoc, high-interest loans from private parties. There was no centralized national treasury. Actual tax collection was farmed out to private contractors who pocketed much of the yield. For most of the century, the two wealthiest groups in the country, the aristocrats and the clergy, paid few or no taxes. During the 7 Years' War, Louis XV had imposed a special war tax on everyone, as well as a tax on office holders. But after the war, he kept those taxes on the books over the protests of the aristocracy and clergy. This led to a storm of protest from nobles, office holders, local parlement, who argued, using the language of philosophes, that this infringed on their ancient rights. But the great-grandson of Louis XIV held firm. In 1774, he died and was succeeded by Louis XVI. Now, Louis XVI was a shy, amiable man. He loved to play with watches and clocks. He was weak and fairly simple. He flirted with reform, but as in Russia, Prussia, and Austria, France, or the French ruling elite, wasn't ready for reform. Louis's reform policy conflicted with his policy to achieve a quiet life, and to achieve that, he had to placate the nobility. So, he restored the powers to the Parlement, he repealed the new taxes. This didn't actually make the aristocracy any more tractable. When Louis called an assembly of notables to address the financial crisis caused by the American War in early 1787, representatives of the nobility questioned whether there really was a crisis, charged that the court just wanted more money, and demanded to examine the books. Can you imagine what Louis XIV would have said? As a result of these policies and the cost of the American War and the failure of the French government to do anything about it, government debt grew. Now, as anyone who has ever gone into debt knows, the more you borrow, the higher the rate of interest you're charged. France paid higher interest rates than any other country in Europe. By 1787, 1/2 of all government revenue was going to pay the interest on the debt. Now, to put that in perspective, the corresponding figure for the USA, depending upon how you calculate it, is, at the time of this taping, roughly between 4.4 and 9% of our revenue. By early 1789, the French crown was in deep financial crisis. What made the crisis especially destructive was that the group that was largely expected to solve it was the poorest 80% of the population, the peasantry. Now, the peasants had actually seen their lot improve a little bit during the 18th century. There were long periods in the 18th century without famine. There were also long periods without war, 1714 to 38, 1748 to 56, 1763 to 78, when taxes did not go through the roof. In 1789, peasants owned 40 to 50% of the land in France. That was a much higher proportion than anywhere else in Europe. But the high tax burden, combined with seigneurial dues and church tithes, still meant that many peasants lived on the margins of poverty. A bad harvest could spell disaster. The harvest of 1788-89 was terrible, and the result was a dangerous food shortage. In addition, since 1786, there'd been a textile depression, and 100,000 workers were out of work. The famine led to the starvation of the poorest peasants. Everybody else lost purchasing power because food prices went up. That include peasants and also urban workers, known, by the way, as sans-culottes, without knee breeches, because as working men, they wore trousers. Landlords reacted by raising grain prices and rents to keep their profit margins up. This left the peasants unable to pay the taille. The traditional defenders of the peasants were the 13 regional parlements, led by the Parlement of Paris. They were supposed to ratify royal decrees, but they frequently protested them, and they especially protested decrees about religion and high taxes. So they came to be seen increasingly as defending the liberties of the subject against the crown. I'd like you to note the beginning of the notion, already common in England, that the interests of the crown were not necessarily the interests of France. In May of 1788, Louis XVI, pursuing his interests, abolished the Parlement. The government financial crisis reached the boiling point in August of 1788. There was a breakdown of law and order. People treated royal officials derisively. The perception grew that the French government was actually the problem. The king responded on the 8th of August by calling the Estates General for the first time since 1614 to meet in May. Now, before going further, it's important to understand how this ancient institution of the Estates General worked. The Estates General was a tricameral body of 1,200 delegates representing the traditional estates of France. The first estate was the clergy. That comprised about 100,000 people owning maybe 10% of the land. The second estate was the aristocracy. That's about 400,000 people owning maybe 20 to 25% of the land. The third estate was the commonality, everybody else. That's about 95% of the population. Now here's the catch. To pass any legislation in the Estates General, you had to win the approval of 2 of the houses or estates. Do you see the problem here? What are the odds that the clergy or the aristocracy were going to join with the third estate in anything? The third estate was elected by all adult males, not comprehended in the other 2. And so, all across France in the spring of 1789, Frenchmen did something they had never done before. At least, not these Frenchmen, not in these lifetimes. They voted. They also wrote down their grievances in cahiers de doléances, letters of grievance, or, if you will, letters of misery. Now, since poor farmers had little standing, they're not going to get elected. Those who got elected were more likely to be members of the middling orders, lawyers, bankers, merchants, etc. Let's talk about the middling orders in the French Revolution. Like the peasantry, they were dissatisfied with the status quo in France, but unlike the peasantry, they could possibly do something about it. Middling people had been reading their philosophes. They found repugnant aristocratic and clerical privilege, especially the refusal to pay taxes. They hated rising taxes themselves because, of course, they had to pay too. They hated the persecution of religious minorities. They didn't like the government interference in personal and economic lives. Do you remember Colbert's closely regulated economy? They hated inefficient government and the antiquated legal system and the court at Versailles, which had now come to epitomize in the person of Marie Antoinette, the king's wife, privilege and corruption, extravagance and waste, as contrasted with their own lack of power. Many of the middling orders took up the plight of the peasants as expressed in the Cahiers de Doléances. They argued for an end of absolutism, a limitation on the powers of the crown, and a permanent legislature. But there was a problem. Remember that no matter what the Third Estate approved, the structure of the Estates General dictated that they had to win over one other estate, or the reform would be stillborn. The result was a flood of pamphlets demanding vote by head, not by house. For example, in What is the Third Estate?, the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès called the nobility, quote, a malignant disease which preys upon and tortures the body of a sick man. Here the metaphor, the body politic, is turned against its conventional users. The Estates General convened in May of 1789. Now the king immediately began by refusing to rule on how the estate should vote. And this is typical of Louis XVI. He will vacillate his way through the revolution. After a month of inaction in June, the Third Estate lost patience and invited members of the other two to join them to form a national assembly. Some nobles and most clergy, also having read their philosophes, actually did so. So the Third Estate breaks away, it forms a national assembly. By the way, this included the Marquis de Lafayette, who would later on raise and command a National Guard to defend the assembly. This ad hoc body proclaimed itself the National Assembly of France on the 17th of June. Government officials reacted by locking them out of their Parisian meeting place. And so on the 20th of June, the National Assembly decided to meet in an indoor tennis court across the street. There, they took the famous tennis court oath that they would not leave the tennis court until France had a new constitution. Now, at this point, the king had another opportunity to take decisive action. He could have embraced the actions of the National Assembly and, in effect, co-opted the revolution. Or he could send troops to expel the National Assembly from the tennis court. Instead, once again, he did nothing. And this was the gravest mistake of all, for it created an information vacuum into which the people could pour their fear and rumors. It wasn't until the 23rd of June that the king finally took a stand. He proposed new reforms, a reform of the financial system. He promised to seek the permission of the Estates General for new taxes. But he still insisted on voting by estates, and this was perceived as an attack on the National Assembly, which he confirmed by surrounding troops. In fact, just 7 days later, on the 30th of June, he backtracked and approved voting by head, but it was too late. The Estates General was as dead as the Roman Senate. By this time, the sans-culottes of Paris, the working people of Paris, encouraged by the formation of the National Assembly, worried that Louis would crush it, had begun to organize. On the 14th of July, 1789, they stormed the Bastille, looking for arms. They took over the prison and freed the prisoners, of which there were only about 7. When informed of this, Louis is reputed to have asked, "Is it a rebellion?" To which came the reply, "Your Majesty, it is a revolution." The sans-culottes subsequently took over the government of Paris. Small uprisings raged throughout France in the summer of 1789. This was known as the Great Fear. Peasants were worried that aristocrats were hoarding grain. They burned landed estates and often the records of the estates so that the nobleman wouldn't know how much rent was owed. Aristocrats feared and fled, worried for their own lives. In the meantime, as France burned, the National Assembly, renamed the Constituent Assembly on the 9th of July, worked on the new Constitution. It took 2 years. It had to accomplish 3 things. First, abolish the old privileges of the nobility and clergy to clear the ground. Second, it needed a statement of purpose, a mission statement. And third, they had to write up the Constitution itself. First came the abolition of aristocratic privilege, and that came in one dramatic moment on the 4th of August, 1789, when the Vicomte de Noailles stood before the National Assembly and renounced his privileges as an aristocrat. He said that from henceforward he would be known only as Citizen de Noailles. In a sort of fever of democratic feeling, other aristocrats in the room stood up and did the same thing. This was the end of special treatment in law for aristocrats. It was the end of serfdom and seigneurial rights. According to one historian, in effect, the old regime was dismantled in one night of heated oratory. Aristocrats who didn't want to give up their privileges fled France. They came to be known as the émigrés. The statement of ideals came within a month. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was ratified on the 26th of August, 1789. It was intended as a prologue to the as yet unwritten Constitution. But like our Declaration of Independence, it was also supposed to justify the revolution in the eyes of the world. In many ways, it's a summary of Enlightenment thought on the state. It begins by asserting that only the National Assembly represented the people of France. Now, remember that up to this point, the king represented the people of France. It then asserts the rights of man, arguing that their violation is, quote, the sole cause of the public calamities and of the corruption of governments. Now, compare that to the old medieval worldview, which said that calamities were a punishment from God for sin, and that man was naturally corrupt after the fall. This is an Enlightenment break. At the same time, the document doesn't deny God. It says that the rights of man are natural, inalienable, and sacred. It goes on to guarantee that men are born free and equal, and that the aim of all political association is maintenance of their rights. John Locke again. It also asserts that those rights include personal freedom of thought and religion. There you've got Voltaire. And equality before the law, sanctity of property rights. Laws were to be made and taxes levied only by the citizens and their representatives. And finally, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen states that the people, not the king, are sovereign. That's a bit of Rousseau. This is one of the seminal documents in the history of Western civilization, but it wasn't all that radical. It says nothing about the rights of women. This led women to political demonstrations. Olympe de Gouges reacted with her own Declaration of the Rights of Women in 1791, arguing that woman is born free and equal to man in her rights. If a woman has the right to mount the scaffold, she should equally have the right to mount the rostrum. Now, nothing in the Declaration addressed the gross inequalities of wealth and property in Ancien Regime France. And more ominously, it doesn't address the proper balance of rights between the individual and the state. Now again, Louis has an opportunity, right? He could embrace the document, he could wave it over his head. But Marie Antoinette urged Louis to suppress the revolution. She was already unpopular in France because of her loyalty to Austrian interests and her well-known extravagance. There's no evidence that she ever said to starving peasants, "Let them eat cake," but still historians often blame a circle of conservative courtiers around her for influencing the king against the revolution. As before, Louis hesitated, only approving the Declaration of the Rights of Man months later, when it was too late to get ahead of the issue. He would soon lose the power of choice. On the 5th of October, 1789, a crowd of Parisian women, reacting to rumors that the king would act against the revolution, escorted by National Guards, led by the Marquis de Lafayette, stormed the royal palace of Versailles and forced the royal family into a sort of house arrest at Paris in the Tuileries Palace. Louis XIV's worst nightmare had returned. In the meantime, it took 2 years for the Constituent Assembly to draft the new Constitution for France. The result shows the influence of the British and American Revolution. First, France would remain a monarchy, but one governed by a constitution. So France becomes a constitutional, no longer an absolute monarchy. The king was no longer divine. Rather, he was the first officer of the state. He retained control of the military and foreign policy, and he could exercise a suspensive veto, 2 years, on legislation coming out of the legislature. The legislature was the more powerful branch of this constitution. It was unicameral and elected every 2 years. It would initiate legislation, control the budget, and it had the exclusive right to declare war. The electorate would consist of male citizens with property. That's about 4 million out of 25 million French potential electors. Some estimates are higher. Now, remember, this constitution was drawn up by the middling orders, a few aristocrats and clergy. It's not going to be that radical or democratic. There was an even stricter property qualification for a seat in the legislature. Basically, you had to be well off. Still, this is the widest franchise in Europe and more democratic than Britain. In terms of local government, the old provinces of France were to be abolished. France was to be divided into 83 equal departments, each the same size, with its own administration and courts. This is very Enlightenment and rational, right? Everything's mathematical. The departments would do most of the work of government. They would maintain law and order and collect taxes and run the courts, provide public education and poor relief. There would be about 40,000 local officials. These would be elected by all local males. The church was to be federalized. That is to say, its lands were to be confiscated by the state and used to pay off the government's debts. Some would be redistributed to the peasantry. The clergy were to become paid officials of the state. Priests and bishops were to be elected by property-owning citizens who needn't be Catholic. Indeed, the priests and bishops needn't be Catholic. The dioceses were to be coterminous with government departments, and the clergy were to be forced to take an oath of loyalty to the new constitution. The papacy condemned this. It goes totally against the idea of loyalty to Rome. Those who refused to take the oath became the nucleus of a resistance movement. In terms of society and the economy, the point of the Constitution was to eliminate privilege. The nobility were no longer to be recognized in law as being special. All were to be equal under the law, including blacks and mulattoes, which had not been true under Louis's regime. Slavery was to be maintained in the colonies, however, because of its economic benefits. So, again, this is not that radical a constitution. Guilds and monopolies were abolished. Still, this is truly revolutionary. It goes farther than the English revolutions of the 17th century. But note that, apart from those of the church, property rights were maintained, and in fact, property was the key to participation. Still, the new constitution made it easier to own land, it enshrined equality before the law, it decentralized the bureaucracy, and remarkable for France, it limited the power of the ruler. The problem with it was that it depended on the cooperation of that ruler, of the ruling class, of the people of France, and of the rest of Europe. So guess how things turned out? Almost none of these groups was satisfied with the Constitution of 1791. Let's start at the bottom of the social scale. Peasants were upset because they wanted to vote for the legislature. They didn't want to limit the vote to the propertied. They wanted an end to economic disparities. They wanted some of that nice, fertile, aristocratic land. The Pope and clergy were upset by the loss of land and the fact that they lost their exclusive place as the sole legal religion in France. The aristocracy was upset at the loss of privilege. They yearned for the Ancien Regime. And then there was the king. Once again, Louis XVI faced a crossroads and therefore an opportunity. He could have embraced the new constitution and made himself the first citizen of France, but he really wanted no part of it. In June of 1791, he fled Paris in secret, in disguise, leaving behind a written denunciation of the revolution. His plan was to escape to Austria, the homeland of Marie Antoinette, borrow an Austrian army, and use it to restore him to power. Instead, he was seized by revolutionary guards at Varennes, near the Austrian border. They recognized him because his portrait was on the money. Hey, isn't that the king? This was a turning point for the Constitution and indeed for the French Revolution. Louis was completely discredited. The government had no real effective head now. Émigrés fled in droves. The governments of Europe reacted to Louis's imprisonment. In August of 1791, the governments of Austria and Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, urging all European monarchs to band together to restore Louis. In April of 1792, Austria and Prussia invaded France. Eventually, they were to be joined by the crowned heads of Great Britain, Spain, Russia, and Sardinia. Now let's note what's going on here. These guys couldn't agree on anything before 1792. Austria and Prussia were always at each other's throats. But now their club was threatened. If the people of France could overthrow the greatest monarch in Christendom, who was next? If the events of 1791-92 alarmed the crowned heads of Europe, they opened the eyes of the French people. For centuries, the French people had been taught that the king was God's chosen, that he was their loving father, and the physical embodiment of France. L'État, c'est moi. When French people paid taxes, When they went off to war, they didn't do that out of loyalty to some abstract concept, France. They didn't do it out of loyalty to a flag or a constitution. They did it out of a personal loyalty to the king. That's how monarchy was supposed to work. You were a subject of a king. You were not a citizen with rights and the right of participation. But now the king, so it's much more like a family, right? But the king had just proven that he didn't care for France, that he would invite foreigners into its very heart to attack its own people in order to preserve his power, his privilege, his way of life at Versailles. Clearly, he loved being a king. He loved that power more than he loved the people of France. This was the ultimate moment of realization. It was like catching one's lover in the arms of another lover. In reaction to this, as the armies of all Europe massed against the French people and their revolution, French nationalism was born. From now on, the French peasant, the sans-culotte, the merchant, the lawyer would defend not their king, but their homeland. It was in reaction to this situation that a revolutionary officer named Roger de Lille penned what became the French national anthem, the Marseillaise. Undoubtedly, you have heard this piece of music, perhaps seen it sung in the famous scene in Casablanca. You know how it goes. Allons, enfants de la patrie, l'heure de gloire est arrivée. Okay, with pronunciation like that, I'm never going to be a member of the French Academy. And with a voice like that, I'm never going to sing at the Met. For our purposes, you should probably imagine this sung by vast crowds in public squares, or perhaps by revolutionary soldiers on the march. I think that this song is in its way every bit as important as the Declaration of the Rights of Man, for it asserts a new principle, the principle of nationhood. Let's look at the words. Allons, enfants de la patrie. Arise, children of the fatherland. You're no longer children of a king. You're children of the land, the patrie, the fatherland, France. The day of glory has arrived. Against us, bloody tyranny's bloody standard is raised. Listen to the sound in the fields, the howling of those fearsome soldiers. Those soldiers are the Austrian and Prussian army. They're coming into our fields to ruin them, to take our food, to take our children, to rape our wives, to take away France and our revolution. And so comes the famous refrain, aux armes, citoyens, to arms, citizens. Citizens. Not subjects of a king. Citizens. Form your battalions. March on, march on. The battalions, of course, are the battalions of a citizen army. The Marseillaise goes on to knock monarchy. What do they want? This horde of slaves, that would be the soldiers, of traitors and conspiratorial kings. So if you're a subject, you're a slave, right? For whom these vile chains, these long prepared irons? Well, for Frenchmen, of course, they're coming to enslave us, which is how we now think of our previous life under this tyrant Louis XVI. What outrage, what methods must be taken? It is us they dare plan to return to the old slavery. So they're going to take away our revolution. They're going to turn back the clock. What? These foreign cohorts? What? These mercenary phalanxes? As opposed to citizens in arms, these are mercenary soldiers. They're getting paid to do this. They would cut down our warrior sons, tremble tyrants and traitors. Against you, we are all soldiers. That citizen army again. If they fall, our young heroes, France will bear new ones, because France is the fatherland and the motherland to fight against you. This song would inspire the French people to rally to the revolution, to form a citizen army, and to defeat the invading Prussians and Austrians at the Battle of Valmy in 1792. I have cited it as an example of this moment of French nationalism, but I think it's also a great example of the sheer emotionalism of the French Revolution. The French Revolution is all about emotion. The storming of the Bastille, the moment when the Viscount de Noailles strips himself of his aristocratic privilege. That must have been a great impulsive moment. This was also the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, which along with the ensuing Napoleonic Wars would last on and off to 1815. Why? because the French Revolution threatened every crowned head, every aristocrat, every bishop in Europe. And so, just as foreign powers had stepped in to quash earlier rebellions in the Netherlands and Poland, so the European ruling elite will rise up to try to crush the French Revolution. We will discuss the significance of these wars in European history in later lectures. For the moment, their significance for France and the Revolution is that they threw the French Republic into the arms of the most radical revolutionary faction. In the next lecture, Maximilien Robespierre, his radical Jacobin party, and the Reign of Terror.